Welcome to the afternoon session, the first session. This afternoon, comrades, are entitled USSR, a Marxist post-mortem by Jack Conrad. I wanted to hold up a few books in order to promote the session, but I've discovered they're all sold out already, which is, I'd like to think, is a positive sign. Okay, so I'll pass you over to Jack, and then there'll be the usual format then of discussion subsequent to his opening remarks.
Well, the first question, I suppose, is does the Soviet Union still matter? 40, 50 years ago, world politics was defined by the Soviet Union. The left was defined by the Soviet Union. You had a different view on the Soviet Union, you formed a different group. My argument really is here that if and when, and I believe it's a matter of when, Marxism, communism, socialism revives, they will use what happened in the Soviet Union against us. So I think that if we haven't got answers, we'll just be bashed over the head. I haven't read, Donald Trump's latest outbursts in any detail. Maybe there's no details to read. Nonetheless, what Donald Trump begins, clearly, foundations, universities, politicians, TV programs, etc., can follow up on. In other words, if you look at what's going on in the United States, we don't want to get too excited by it, but nonetheless, in the United States, when this word socialism is not only used by our enemies, but it has a reality in terms of voters, in terms of members of the DSA. A DSA now, remember the opening by our mug comrade earlier in the week, a DSA now equipped with at least a programmatic statement that is written by Marxists and clearly inspired by Marxism, right? That is something. And so I think it's not because we'll have a DSA, it's not that every country will follow the exact path, but I am convinced, as I said before, that it's more a question of when Marxism, when communism, when socialism revives, they will hit us with what happened in the Soviet Union. We've already referred this week, to the raw material, even in a country like Britain. 800,000 people. Okay, I know it's your party, but in expressing an interest in your party, that shows that there is mass opinion, not only in Britain, that's dissatisfied with things, but is actually looking to some sort of alternative society. This is human raw material that could be organised into a party, in my view, and this isn't the subject of my opening, if the left could get its act together. Okay. So I think that what we need is an honest, self-critical, thoroughgoing, and I'd also add scientific answer to what happened in the Soviet Union. I think apologetics are worse than useless. So, for my sins, I think I refer to someone, Kenny Coyle wrote a series of articles, about the purges in the Soviet Union. He said, well, latest research reveals that not that many died. A lot of them were criminals. If you look at the United States, it locks up, 1 million black people. So things weren't that bad. Robert Griffiths, the former General Secretary of the CPB, spoke about unfortunate violations of socialist democracy. Socialism, democracy, violations of, and frankly, Trotskyism in various varieties isn't that different. I haven't spoken to a member of the Spartacus League about this recently, but what you tend to get is, well, they didn't have any unemployment. Well, people had housing. Everyone had, you know, some sort of education. And, of course, what we had is nationalised property. Well, okay, comrades. I think that this is worse than useless. When I was actually talking in Australia, I was actually in my room talking to a meeting in Australia. From my memory, I was putting forward my argument about the Soviet Union. Remember the Spartacist League said, what about Treptow Park in 1989? This is when the Spartacist League called a demonstration. It's a huge park in Berlin with an anti-war statue. It was taken over by the Socialist Unity Party. So it was a huge demonstration. They were expecting, I was expecting, in 89, 90, 91-ish, I was expecting a political revolution. I was expecting on some level the working class to act. Okay, did it act? Well, the miners went on strike in the Soviet Union. In defence of what? In defence of the system? No. The workers never acted in defence of the system. We all remember Ceausescu, that big demonstration. There he is, you know, coming out to be lauded by the masses, and people start booing, right? Shoot them. The workers, people, overthrow the system. Also has to be said that it isn't just from below. Look at Yeltsin, look at Gorbachev, look at almost all the first generation of oligarchs, the billionaires, right? These were people at the top, right? Or the sons and daughters of people at the top who collapsed the system, who wanted to become capitalists. They wanted to get in on the gravy train of the West. Just look around London, go to Kensington, go to Mayfair, go to Highgate, and you'll find their houses. You know, look at football clubs a few years ago. So we need to have answers for this. You know, if the Soviet Union, you know, had carried on as I'd imagined it in my youth, you know, when I joined the Young Communist League, you know, 13, what was meant to happen is the Soviet Union, in spite of all of the problems that it had experienced, was meant to grow, 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 grow. It was growing twice, 3 times faster than the United States. And all you need to do is draw one of Bill's graphs. There's the Soviet Union doing that. There's the United States doing that. You know, Khrushchev talked about catching up and then overtaking the United States. Was it 1970? This is in a program by 1970, if I get the date right, introducing communism by 1980 in one country, right? If that had happened, well, okay, you can mock my naivety believing it, but if that had happened, if that system had proved successful, if it could have spread, if the labour movement in the West looked at that model and said full employment, living standards constantly going up, and you know they're starting to democratise, Isaac Deutscher believed that was going to happen. If all of that happened, then here we are in 2026, we'll be living under socialism. We might even be able to tackle, a bit more dubious, the climate crisis. But you get my point, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The workers, to the extent they acted against the system. The elite acted against the system. Anyway, Soviet Union, 1989, 1991, it collapsed. And I can remember I was talking to my friend Lisa, I can't remember who with. Oh, it doesn't matter who with, it's who about. And I can remember going to a seminar with Lisa, because we had seminars down there at the diorama. I think we got off at Warren Street, and there's Stan. And so Stan comes up to us, and Stan is giving Lisa a lecture about the socialist states. And you know, there's North Korea, and there's Cuba, and there's the Soviet Union. And inwardly, I was going, really got to think about this because I think Stan's talking a load of bollocks. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we got together a load of articles. They're selected, but a series of, and we put them into some sort of coherent form. I think some of the essays, some of the articles are still very good. I'm not ashamed of them. But what the original blurb on the back was going to be was something along the lines of Jack Conrad provides a rigorous, fully rounded theory of the Soviet Union. And I knew that that was, again, bollocks, and we changed it to whatever the hell is there. This was meant to be presenting a sort of told you so, right? It was presenting not a fully rounded theory. This was presenting the ideas, the observations of a communist militant in terms of the Soviet Union in the 1980s going into the debacle of 1991. And so what it traces is the expectations, but also assessment of various comrades on the left to what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. So what we had from Chris Harman in Socialist Worker. Chris Harman was Tony Cliff's number 2, leading comrade in SWP-IS. He said, it's collapsed. The Soviet Union has moved sideways, or capitalism has moved sideways. Why? Because Tony Cliff, in his famous, worthwhile reading, but famous book, State Capitalism in Russia, has said, Soviet Union represents the highest possible stage of capitalism. Can't get any higher, there's only socialism after that. We also are dealing with a school of thought that didn't think you could go backwards. There's only a ladder that you have to, humanity does that. So history has moved sideways. We also had the headline in Socialist Worker celebrating, this is the quote, headlining, communism has collapsed, right? We had Peter Taff in, I presume, militant, Peter Taff, leader of the Socialist Party in England and Wales, as is now of. He talked about, this is great, what we've got coming now is the red 1990s. Right? The Euro-communists, I think, in Changes, they said collapse of the Soviet Union proves that the October Revolution was a historic error and should never have happened. So it's against that background, I thought to myself, actually what we need is serious answers. We don't want excuses, we don't want apologetics. We actually need a thoroughgoing approach to what the Soviet Union is, why it actually flourished in its early years, and why it collapsed. Was it CIA agents? You know, was it that Yeltsin was really in the pay of? Maybe, but I don't think that's an adequate explanation. The system was fundamentally healthy, but there were traitors at the top of it. So, in terms of my approach, what I thought, I just thought it as a sort of, well, let's try this. Anyone who knows Lenin's writings most likely has come across his observations about capital, Das Kapital. And he said that Marx never left us a logic. And of course, what he's referring to is Hegel's logic. Anyone who's read Capital, you have to read, if you really want to understand the book or where it's coming from, how it's fashioned, you really have to go back and read Hegel's Science of Logic. In particular, I know Lenin said you have to read it from cover to cover, but actually you would be well off just to read the introduction, the opening of Hegel's Science of Logic. And you can, not only have you got letters from Marx to Engels and Engels to Marx and Marx saying, I've just gone back and, reread the logic. What you've actually got, as soon as you open a copy of Das Kapital, I can see where he's coming from. He's coming from Hegel. Hegel says all science must begin with the most simple. Don't deal with you must master the material, but begin in terms of your manner of presentation with the absolute atomic, the absolute elemental cell of society. And you can see what Marx does. There's Marx, right? He knows a lot about a lot of things. He knows about the history of capitalism. When it comes to his main book, Capital, I know there was a project to write, was it 6 books, of which Capital consists of our present day 3 volumes plus surplus value. He's going to write on the state, write on foreign. But if you look at Capital, volume 1, what's he begin with? He begins with the cell of capitalist society. He begins with the commodity. And then he says, well, what is a commodity? His famous definition is, it is a product. It's a product that is produced by others for other people, for others' use. It's not just something that you fashion and eat. This is something being done as part of some society. And the crucial thing about the commodity, as opposed to the product in terms of other societies, is it has a use value. That's pretty universal, but it is produced because it is an exchange value. And he doesn't leap straight into that. He actually holds back, and he goes through a whole series of arguments, and eventually you arrive at, hey, this society is really stupid if it is not producing for a surplus. So he goes through formulas, like CMC. That's quite sensible, he says. So simple, there's some seats here, a seat there. So yeah, he goes through a whole series of arguments. So he begins with commodity, money as a medium of exchange, and then says you go to market and you get another commodity. That's quite sensible. But if you start with money, if you start that circuit with money, what's the point of starting with money, going to the market, getting your commodity, and then selling what you've done for the same amount of money? What's that all about? That doesn't make any sense. So he says it only makes sense, and this starts to get to grips with capitalist society, if you're going to market, if you're exchanging your commodity for not only money, the equivalent, but extra money. And then he develops the argument, where the hell does this surplus come from? Is it cheating? Is it particular people being particularly clever? Anyway, you know the argument, it comes back to labour. Okay, so that's the sort of approach I try to take with the Soviet Union. So I asked myself, well, what does the Soviet Union, what did it produce commodities? My answer was, no, it didn't produce. Product wasn't being produced for exchange value. It was being produced for use value. So we don't have commodity production. I know Khrushchev and Stalin talked about commodity. It's a nonsense, right? So I developed the argument around the Soviet product. And I say that the Soviet Union's product isn't motivated by gaining extra money. It's not aimed at capital accumulation. It is driven, it's judged by what they called the plan, what they called control figures that I'm calling, for want of anything better, target values. So the Soviet product has a use value on the one side, and as far as what I would call, again for the sake of the argument, it's just a name, what I call Gosplan, the Central Planning Authority, which wasn't in total control, but that's the sort of, how should I put it, helps the argument along to imagine it was. So what we've got on the one side is a commodity that is designed to satisfy use values of those that are consuming it, but is guided and is ticked off, it's driven by those that give it what I call target value. I would make the argument that the idea that the Soviet Union was a planned society is a joke. You cannot take that seriously. Yes, they set, figures that this factory, this group of workers, this republic are meant to fulfill. And what you actually find, and it's so easy, read Stalin, read Molotov, read Gorbachev, read Khrushchev, any general secretary, any prime minister will tell you that what you had is a situation of systematic lying in society. What you had is a systematic failure to actually produce qualities. I begin my book by including a quote from Leon Trotsky saying the Soviet Union has proved its existence with the first 5-year plan, through millions of tons of steel, through thousands of miles of railways laid and production. But he goes on to say that quality is actually what gives a system its right to victory. And what you find in the Soviet Union is consistently a failure to meet quality. So you can read anecdotal accounts. I must admit, when I first read it, I sort of took a sort of black humour approach to it. TV sets. You get a new TV set, you plug it in, you switch it on, and it blows up, and it causes your apartment to catch fire. Well, as I say, I've got a black sense of humour. But if you take all manner of different consumer goods, sugar, grain, bread, cars, clothes, everything, everywhere you looked, there's a shortfall, there's dissatisfaction with the quality of the goods. Now, when it came to the consumer, the average Joe like you and me, you weren't high on the list of priorities as far as the system was concerned. But when you take other enterprises, they had the same problem. So it wasn't just the consumer, shoddy goods produced for the shops. It was actually shoddy goods that were delivered all through the system. So if, for example, you were in charge of an iron and steel complex and you get a delivery of coal, the typical delivery of coal it will be short, not enough in terms it's not the target, and also it's going to be full of rocks. What do you do about it? Well, you can complain. They did. They can demand better. They did. Did they get better? No. You have a dilemma, though, for the guy in charge. It usually was a guy in charge of your iron and steel complex. He has got to meet his target. He is under a legal obligation. If he doesn't meet his target, can you imagine what happens in the 1930s? He's accused of being a saboteur. What happens is the equivalent of the KGB come around, arrest the manager, arrest the deputy manager, arrest the chief accountant, take them off to the KGB headquarters, maybe get them to sign a confession, maybe give them 12 years in the Gulag, and maybe just shoot them. These are Trotskyists, Bukharinite, depending on what country the Soviet Union was not friendly with, German, Japanese, British, American spies. And so you had an incredible turnover under Stalin of managerial experts. Right? So what do you do under these circumstances when there you are, you've got to produce, I'm just making up the figure, so a ton of steel, and you've got your coal delivery, it's short. What do? Do you tell the central authorities, oh, by the way, comrades, I can't do it? You know that they're going to believe you but not believe you, because they're also under a compulsion to weed out sabotage. What do? If you've got just enough coal. If you can recruit the workers into cooperating with you, what you have is a storming session. So typically in the Soviet Union, with almost every product, what you had is most production in terms of on paper crammed into the last 10 days. And so what workers are doing and what the managers are doing and the accountants, they all come to the factory floor, they're all working like shit. They're all trying to, override the technical norms. And of course, what do they produce? What is going to be produced in terms of steel under those conditions? It's going to be shit steel. But if the manager, right, has still a shortage, what they did, and this is typical, what they do is borrow from the next year's plan. Right? So they say, well, in August, we met the plan, and they borrowed production on paper from September, and so they present it. Well, that just creates another problem when it comes to September. But nonetheless, that is the strategy that managers, and in my book, I readily say, I'm treating workers, managers, KGB officials, Gosplan officials as a type. There were undoubtedly, in the Soviet Union, especially, in the first 5-year plan, there were no question, there were enthusiasts for the plan. People who thought this is going to be the dawn of socialism, this is the future of humanity. So I'm sure there were honest managers. The problem is, if you were an honest manager, you didn't tend to last long as a manager. It's also true, especially amongst the Young Communist League, there were enthusiastic workers who were working in a dedicated way because we want to build socialism. But that pretty quickly comes to an end. And what you get is performance. What you get is show. So you have, I don't know, the best example, I suppose, is Stakhanovite. Well, when you have every worker as a Stakhanovite, it loses all meaning. And it's that was happening in the Soviet Union. So everyone gets a medal, everyone gets a bonus, and of course what happens with a bonus is it becomes a norm. And again, just to show you, the difference in the Soviet Union, what you actually had is wage drift. And not because the central authorities wanted it, but because of spontaneous development. So you end up with a skilled worker getting more than a doctor, getting more than an engineer, the central authorities then going in for wage reductions. And of course, what workers couldn't do is say, well, we're going to go on strike. Well, we could go on strike. What happens when you go on strike? I mean, either they concede or they come away and they pick out the ringleaders and they cart them off. But what workers could do and what workers did do to an incredible degree is move to another enterprise, because what we've got, the comrades on the left who talk about full employment in the Soviet, you're absolutely right. To me, though, it's a bit like a slave owner in Athens boasting, all my slaves are fully employed. Well, what do you expect? I mean, unless someone's ill, why not put them to work? Of course there was full employment. And indeed what you had, with the first 5-year plan, is not only the mobilization of all unemployed people, you had the turn to winning women from the household into the factory. You had massive, recruitment of peasants who were leaving the countryside for particular reasons. And what they could do is quit one enterprise, go down the road, and get employment in another. Because what we have here in this society is what is called a shortage economy. The steel plant is short. The mine is short of equipment, right? They're also always short of workers, and you find that in the first 5-year plan. Managers are complaining, we haven't got our full quota of workers. You also find a situation where you train up someone. How long does it how long does it take to train a worker? Well, it's a piece of string, we all know. But imagine you've got a mine, How quickly can you train someone up to operate a pneumatic pick? I haven't got a damn clue. But a week? I mean, I haven't got a clue, but you can't just give someone a pneumatic drill and say, get on with it. I wouldn't have thought, presumably they would ruin the drill, or they wouldn't know where the oven. Bob is an expert when it comes. He's from Wales, so it's in his blood. Anyway, the point I'm making is precisely with this. The manager, having overseen the training up of worker for this particular enterprise, that particular then they leave. And what you have is statistics, I think reliable statistics, that show you get a labour turnover of over 100% within the year. So workers are streaming into your enterprise and then streaming out. That became illegal. They passed laws against it. Managers who allowed it. You can read the legislation. Some of it's quite chilling, in terms of the threats. Workers who leave their work without permission, that's against the law. 6 months, a year, more. But it didn't stop it. It didn't stop it. Why? Because if you're a manager, are you going to ring up the KGB and say, oh, this worker's presented himself, he's just come from down this, I'm really short of labour. No, you ignore the law and you recruit the worker, because every month you've got to fulfil your quota, and every month you're short, every month you're in danger of being carted off and shot. Now, the shooting stopped with the death of Stalin, but nonetheless the turnover of managers continued. Okay, I'm not going to take much longer. I can't present the full argument. What I thought I would do is just make a few points about the categories that I'm using and show how radically different the Soviet Union was from capitalism, and why you actually need to analyse the Soviet Union as a society according to its own laws, which you can discover through study, through looking at the better Western literature, looking at the Soviet literature. In particular, I've already quoted general secretaries, prime ministers, ministers. They keep complaining about the same thing. This cannot just be aberrant behaviour. It's what Marx would have called an economic law is in operation. And we need to discover the economic laws that are in operation in the Soviet Union if we're going to understand it in a scientific way. So I just wanted to give a few examples. Rubles, someone's going to tell me, of course there was the production of commodities. Went to the Soviet Union, I've been to the Soviet Union. You go to shops, got a ruble sign. That's money, isn't it? That's money. So they except, if you were in the Soviet Union, often what you'd find actually is there might be shelves, but often the shelves were bare. And if you knew the shop assistants, you could nod a wink, promise a favour, and they would come up with the goods from under the counter. You're also in a situation, okay, there you are, you're in a shop, you hand over your 5 rubles and you get shit. But if you know the person behind the counter, they actually give you some decent sausages, for example. We also know that, of course, steel, coal, was given a ruble name. You had to keep a bank account. And what the system did, right, is take the bank account of the consumer industries and just take them. It was called confiscation. Take them and hand them over to the basic producers, because they consistently made a ruble loss. In other words, what I would argue is that rubles weren't money. How does Marx describe money? Medium of exchange, but also an equivalent when it comes back to labour. That isn't what you got in the Soviet Union. Prices were set from the centre, and sometimes, for you and me, crazily. I'll just illustrate it. This is Stalin, I think in 1952-53, his last major book. It's worth reading. economic problems in the USSR. And he describes a scene, it might be apocryphal, but he describes a scene on the Central Committee. The planners come in and say, comrades, I have this plan to reorganise the pricing system. And members of the Politburo, and I think it's Stalin, say, look, your pricing system is really stupid. You're charging more for bread than you are grain. Don't you know that grain goes to make bread, and we have to put it in an oven? What do you expect under those circumstances? Instead of feeding animals grain, they'll feed animals bread. This is crazy. Anyway, my point is that rubles were nominal. They weren't convertible in any meaningful sense on the Western market. We all know that a dollar was meant to equal a ruble. You could go on the streets in Moscow and people will be offering you vastly more than that. So I would also argue, and this goes way back, that wages weren't wages. Wages, again, were often set arbitrarily, there were all sorts of distortions. But crucially, workers didn't consume simply on the basis of the ruble. Rubles were necessary in the Soviet Union, unless you were at the very top. You know, Stalin didn't bother apparently collecting his pay packet. Why should it? You know, but if you're a worker, you know, your flat, I mean, it's incredibly cheap. And it was about being allocated the flat. Who allocated the flat? Enterprises. They had to know you. Now, of course, again, we get into the nitty-gritty of the reality. What about food? Often, as I said, shelves were empty. Who feeds you? The enterprise. And they feed you either rubbish if they have to, or they feed you better food if they can. The manager wants to feed you good food, wants to keep the worker, wants to treat you well if they possibly can. We get, how should I put it, a sort of patriarchal relationship between worker and boss. We don't get the same sort of relationship with the bosses we have in Britain, in the United States, under classical capitalism. The typical boss in a capitalist firm wants to minimise inputs, yeah? You want the minimum amount of coal to produce your maximum amount of good quality steel, if you can, if you sell it. In the Soviet Union, managers wanted the maximum amount of coal. They also wanted the maximum amount of workers. And if they did develop a surplus, which was against the law, well, good, because you could trade it unofficially through a whole system of barter people. Barter, yeah. Okay, so I've already talked about labour. I describe this with labour as negative workers' control. Workers couldn't positively control, they couldn't positively control the product, but they could walk. They could refuse to cooperate with the manager. So imagine the situation, you know, he's desperate, he's got to fulfill the targets. He has to go around the workers and say, look, help me out this time, lads and lasses. And if they like him, they'll help him out. As I said, they'll storm the targets. But if they don't like him, if they think he's a bastard, they go, yeah, of course we'll help you out. Fuck you. And again, so we have a very different relationship. This is my argument. Ask a question, were the workers a class? I think it's an important question because I think I've already illustrated it, that if you take the end of the Soviet Union, the workers didn't act as a class, they didn't identify with the system. It's very rare that you actually saw any manifestation of workers acting as a conscious, organised collective. That really came to an end late 20s, early 30s. So if you wanted an analogy, it's only an analogy, I'm not drawing a direct line. If you wanted an analogy and I asked you, were slaves in ancient Rome on a on an estate, a class? Well, you might answer yes. You might also legitimately answer no. What you've got in the Soviet Union is extreme atomization, not only of workers, but also, we can extend it also to the elite. I mean, I'm not talking about the whole history of Rome, but we all know the Roman Senate, when it was real, members of the ruling class would get up and debate the future. We've all seen pictures and we've all read accounts of Soviet congresses in the 1930s, so 1935. What is it? It's a Stalin loving. Now, apparently, in the corridors, that's one of the stories, people were plotting to get rid of Stalin, and we all know about the Karlov murder. Was it? I don't know. Either way, what we have is unanimous votes, stormy applause, resolutions all passed. That to me isn't a deliberating body. It's a farce. Why they put them on is for show. It had no function in terms of anything that you could describe as democracy. And that went throughout the system. So go to a local trade union meeting or a local party meeting. It's not you that decides to get rid of the party secretary. Someone above tells you to get rid of the party secretary, and usually it's a unanimous vote. It's not you on the collective farm that decides to get a new, chair in. Someone else has decided it, and when he arrives, oh, marvellous, 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 you really are a great guy, and all the rest of it. So I also, when it comes to workers, go into this question of why does it not end up working? You've got the first 5-year plan, second 5-year plan, things are going forward. Okay, at different rates, but it looks fantastic. You look at figures from 1900, compare it with 1920, 1930, 1940. You could see why idiots like me, a kid, bought into the idea that the Soviet Union will bury the West. It will just carry on. Okay, so what the Soviet Union could do is engage in what I would call absolute exploitation, which has its limits. They could make workers work longer. They could increase hours. That has the problem of workers walking out. But they could engage in, how should I put it, relative exploitation once. All know from Capital what relative exploitation is. It's not getting workers to work longer. It's not getting workers just working harder. It's introducing machinery. It's adding machinery, dead labour, to living labour, and the result is you produce a huge amount more. Soviet Union could do that. So if you look at, it's Magnitogorsk steel plant, they bring in American technology, American engineers, miraculously, even according to the engineers, through, heroic efforts, they get it up and they are producing steel. They produce enough steel to build enough T-34s to survive World War II and to get in to Berlin. They could do that. What characteristically, remember I'm talking in very broad brush terms, what they couldn't do is revolutionise the existing means of production. I can always remember as a kid reading Soviet Weekly, as was my wont. And I don't know whether it was going through a phase with perestroika where it began to tell the truth. I can't really remember. But I can, and you can look this up because it was reported in many different places, but I first read it in, as I said, Soviet Weekly. There you are, they're importing Western computers. And you would have thought a manager goes, oh, bloody hell, a Western computer. I don't know what they were called in those days, but I want to get my hands on that. We know what to do with these things. We plug it in and maybe it's an Amstrad, I don't know. You do this and you do that, Typically, and again, this is very broad brush, but typically a manager would leave the bloody package outside in the snow. Right? Because you know it, Anne. You've heard it, you've read it. Now, okay, computers are computers, but it wasn't just computers. Why? What's going on? Are these managers stupid? Are they, to use a wrong phrase. Are they Luddites? No. What they fear is what Gosplan called the ratchet effect, right? So what you want is your production to be in the Goldilocks zone, not too much, not too little, fulfilling your plans or being seen to fulfill your plans. You introduce the computer and the Gosplan authorities will say, well, that means you have to increase your production by 10%. Oh my God, I can only just manage to do it now. I don't know enough about computers, but what I do know is you get glitches, you get that frustration. Why won't you effing work? Right? That's what managers, and therefore let's not introduce them. Right? So typically, this is again typically, what you get is an inability of the system to constantly revolutionize the means of production as under capitalism. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end. Okay, I'm going to speed things up now. I think that this shows you the limits of the Soviet Union. So you have this ability to override the market to begin with, which produces fantastic results by anybody's reckoning. Even the most cynical, Western person, Western historian couldn't deny, with all the aid that came from America, nonetheless the Soviet Union took the war to Berlin and overcame the German army. That's just undeniable. The amount of steel that was produced, Sputnik, first woman in space, first poor bloody dog in space, and all the rest of it. Yeah, all of that was real. But what we then have, I think, you can see already in terms of the description I provided, why you tend towards stagnation. And that's, of course, the famous phrase with Gorbachev, but not just stagnation, but eventually collapse, because the elite stop believing in the system. They look at Western bosses, Western capitalists, the workers who are told that the system is so efficient, we're going to overtake the West, don't believe in the system, don't identify with the system, they are not going to act to save the system, not least because the elite is telling them the great advantages that come with capitalism. They don't mention things like unemployment and the fact that you might be homeless, and we all know what happened with the collapse. One of the biggest drops in living standards and life expectancy the world has ever seen. This is what we warned about. I could see the collapse coming, but where a lot of the left celebrated it and said this is going to be great because after the Stalinists it's going to be us, the workers in the Soviet Union are going to overthrow the bureaucracy, they're going to get hold of the means of production and they're going to use them for democratic purposes, have lots of votes and they'll all be Trotskyists. Didn't happen. We said that the system will collapse. It will collapse, we thought, in general, peacefully. No one's going to take up arms to save the system. And what you'll get is social regression in the East, in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. And what we'll have in the West isn't the red 1990s, but what we called a period of reaction of a special type. They're not going to, in general, come along, pick us up, cart us away. We're just going to be viewed as mad people who want to reenact the October Revolution. And, in broad terms, I think that's an accurate description of what's happened. Things in the West have got worse, but we're not talking about terror. We're not talking about a typical period of reaction. So yes, I'm not ashamed of that book. That's really what I'm saying. But here, this is my first book. I don't think it's sold out because it's going to be such a big event on the left. It is deliberately, by the way, a proof copy because we know that there are mistakes, not least in the index. It doesn't matter. We'll get there. There are 3 other books intended. One on the reproduction of social relations, one on international relations, the Soviet Union relationship to the West, so-called national liberation movements, the labour movement, and then theories of the Soviet Union. And when it came to write this first book, I was in a dilemma to the very end, what to include and what not to include. And I just thought, hey, I'm getting a bit old, and will I actually get round to writing volume 4 if I go about it in that order? I've got all this work on Trotskyism, state capitalism, bureaucratic collectivism, and it sort of makes sense with the argument, sod it, put it in the book. And we've also got Marcel's book, Soviet Union and Western Marxism. And although that's a much narrower study, I think it's an excellent study. Now, just talking about Marcel, first time we had him here, I think we had him talking on that subject, Soviet Union and Western Marxism. And I think in the discussion afterwards, unofficially, he said, well, where do you think I'm coming from? In terms of, because it's a study of, every worthwhile, I should put it, point of view, school of thought. And I said, Marcel, it's bloody obvious where you're coming from, and it's bloody obvious who you agree with. Because although he's, it's obviously Hillel Tikhtin. You obviously think his theory is proved right. It's clearly superior to orthodox Trotskyism. It's clearly superior to state capitalism. It's clearly superior, even compared with Moshe's theory of bureaucratic collectivism, which is, by the way, the best, I think, bureaucratic collectivism, which Moshe doesn't adhere to. So I wanted just to finish, really, just saying that this book is not only the result of decades and hours of work, it is also possible because of Hillel and his ideas, and that's why I was so pleased that Hillel, when we asked him, could we dedicate the book to you, to my dear friend and comrade Hillel, he said yes. And so I am extremely grateful to Hillel, and so 3 cheers for Hillel, I think. So.
Okay, thank you, Jack. So we have just over an hour, so welcome questions, contributions from the floor.
A few people online have their hands up.
Okay, you have to tell me who they are because I haven't got access to.
Yes, Rafal and Ted.
Okay, so can I take, there's nobody on the floor from here yet, so can I take the comrades online first, Raphael and Ted?
Just hold on. Go ahead to see if you can hear.
Raphael, if you want to go first.
Raphael.
Raphael.
Hello? Rafal, can you say something? Rafal, do you want to speak?
If not, can we go to Ted, perhaps?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. There's a bit of feedback.
You have to switch off your speaker.
Okay. Can someone put in the chat if I can be heard? Okay. Great. So, I'll start. Thank you to Jack for the introduction. Very interesting. I agree with a good deal of it. I think you're completely right that commodities were not produced in the USSR in the manner described in Capital. They were not produced for the sake of surplus in currency. However, I do think there are some quibbles. So, yes, the Soviet system operated on, why was surplus extracted? It was extracted to meet targets, but, why did those targets exist? They did not exist exclusively to produce use values. They produced surplus in order to perform capital accumulation, primitive socialist accumulation. So it was not simply a system that produced use values. They accrued surplus because they had to compete in a geopolitical context. So the system did not exist in a vacuum. It existed within the nation-state system. It competed with other capitalist powers. It existed in the context of global capitalism. What we see in the Soviet Union, and I think the central difference between the Soviet system and capitalism as it was organized in the West, which accounts for the character of production, is the absence of the market mechanism. This is simply a very simple consequence of nationalization, collectivization of state ownership, that there is no market competition. At most you can try to simulate it, but it's not a real market. So what you have is a lack of labor discipline, which in the early days you can make up for with revolutionary enthusiasm. You have Lenin at the Subotnik, you have the Stakhanovite movement, you have the promotion of revolutionary enthusiasm, but ultimately that runs out, especially as you start seeing the degeneration, the bureaucratization, and the lack of authentic democracy for the workers. So the revolutionary enthusiasm runs out, and then what do you do to enforce labor discipline? You resort to terror. You resort to terror against the workers, against the managers, to try to reach the quotas. And then ultimately, that too reaches its limit, which is, after Stalin's death, you have the liberalization, you have the fall. Obviously, terror against the working class never fully dies down in the Soviet Union, but it does die down somewhat. And that's when you have stagnation, and you also have the development of new methods of enforcing labor discipline, which is where you see the attempts at decentralization, introducing profit incentives for individual enterprises, accounting, that sort of thing, because they're trying to enforce labor discipline in a system that without a market. So what is the Soviet Union then? What is this nationalized system without a market, where you say that rubles aren't real currency, the wages aren't real wages, but is that still not look at the example of a company town in, say, 20s, 10s, 20s America. That is a self-contained little economic community, a capitalism in one country, in one company town, where there is no market, the wages are fake, you're paid in company scrip, but is that still not capitalism? It exists in the context of a larger capitalist economy that exists around it. Its production, its accumulation of surplus, its exploitation of workers is for the sake of competing in the larger capitalist economy beyond the bounds of the company town. But yes, the workers in that company town are paid fake wages. There is no exchange, there is no market. Everything is controlled by a mini state in the form of the company. So yeah, moreover, the company town, just as the USSR, are those then therefore not workers because they're not operating in a pure market capitalism? Well, they are propertyless, and they work for wages in a factory system. What was the Soviet Union doing in the 20s and the 30s? It was proletarianizing Russia on a mass scale. What is it that capitalism does? It proletarianizes. It's the core thing that capitalism does. and in doing so creates its own gravediggers. The Soviet Union was stripping the smallholder class of its property, stripping the peasantry and proletarianizing them, whether that's making them move into the cities to work in factories or working on collective and state farms where they were turned from peasants into rural proletarians. This comes down then, what was the Soviet Union? We have this worker state that emerges in the revolution that represents the working class, which is then decimated by a civil war, mass deproletarianization that takes place. And we have a society that's trapped in transition between capitalism and socialism. The lack of workers' democracy means that there is no socialist incentive to do democratic planning to meet targets. And we're forced to resort to these other methods for labor discipline to generate surpluses to compete. So yes, we have the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is economically the mode of production remains capitalism under a worker state, but which, due to the failures of the October Revolution, failures of the World Revolution, remains undemocratic and degenerates. The capital that's embodied in state property is not in itself a capitalist class, but without worker leadership to the worker state, there is over time a degenerating incentive to privatize and seize the enterprises by the managers, by the bureaucracy. So in conclusion, I'd like to draw that all modes of production, I think, can be centralized or decentralized. Feudal relations of production differed between, say, Western Europe and China, but nonetheless, they were modes of production based on the exploitation of tenant farmers, of serfs on the land. But in Western Europe, this was land parceled out between a large nobility, whereas in China, their land ownership, it differed during different historical periods. It was not a stable thing, but there were times where it was very much centralized in the hands of the state and managed by a Mandarin class of bureaucrats drawn from the gentry intelligentsia, who enacted the policy of, a feudal policy of extracting tax revenue from the peasantry. And what we see is that revolutionary breakthroughs in the mode of production happen in the more decentralized economic modes. So, capitalism develops in the places where feudal control is weakest and most decentralized, in the Netherlands, in the Italian city-states. In China, it is slowed down where the feudal state, which is so centralized and powerful, is able to crack down. I'm finishing up. Crack down on the merchants and restrict the development of capitalism. And you see the same thing in the Soviet Union, which is why the promise of socialism needs to be that workers' democracy and democratic plan can overcome the problem of centralized property limiting incentives. Thank you. Sorry for going on too long.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, thanks for the talk, Jack. Really good stuff. I think it's a really valuable contribution to this topic. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry, I can't hear you, but I can see that you said yes. Sorry. So I think the points I want to make, I'll try and keep it brief. I mean, I don't know how we can classify the Soviet Union as a system of capital accumulation when it didn't have commodities and a market. I mean, Raphael makes a lot of other good points, but just on that point, I think it's a bit of a contradiction. The thing is, we're talking about the relations of production. So are the relations of production privately owned or are they socially owned? And without private relations of production, it's not capital accumulation. It's not a capitalist mode of production. So the Soviet Union was a socialist mode of production, but I do agree with Jack that quality was the big issue, right? But why was that? Now there's the issue of geography and what Russia and the Eastern Europe had available to it resource-wise. And then, of course, there's the, endless attacks from the capitalists, the imperialists in the West, starting, straight away with the invasion of 13 countries as soon as 1917 happens. The ongoing, then the Second World War, the Civil War, then the ongoing blockades and economic sanctions and so on and so forth. I think there should be some acceptance to some extent, not that this is to sort of denounce 1917, but there should be some sort of recognition that the Soviet Union emerged prematurely in sort of historical technological terms. It was a bit of a big leap from a sort of semi-feudal, semi-capitalist mode of production to trying to implement socialism for the first time. I'm absolutely glad that it happened. I think it was a brilliant event in history, and I support it all the way. But I think that's part of the context that we should take into account. And then, of course, the difficulty of getting resources, importing resources into the country, into the Soviet Union was very difficult. And they had to make some concessions to the private sector, if you like, on a global scale in order to be able to do that, including allowing, it made sense to have a black market to some extent to get foreign currency into the country so that they could trade with other countries. If you've got to trade with other countries that are capitalist, that makes it more difficult to plan your economy because you've got fluctuating prices on the world market and so on and so forth. But so the problems that the Soviet Union had were largely a manifestation of these problems. Obviously you've got to take human nature into account and, all of the difficulties. There's only so much capacity to tackle these problems, only so much human energy to go around. Just on its collapse, I think it's really important, again, to put it in the context of capitalism globally. I think the primary reason for the Soviet Union's collapse, and it sort of was being chipped away at steadily the whole time, right, was the global crisis of capitalism itself. What I talked about the other day in my talk, one of the big countervailing tendencies that capitalism and capitalists have to pursue to keep capitalism going is privatization, right? So they didn't want to just destroy the Soviet Union because it was some sort of ideological threat, providing some sort of appeal to the rest of the world's workers that they might flock to. It was the fact that they did actually need to re-privatize what wasn't privatized in the Soviet Union, which is perhaps more evidence to say that it was a socialist system, albeit a very sort of primitive one that emerged prematurely.
Okay. I think it was excellent what you spoke about. Right, I remember in '92, we had the book by Franz Fukuyama saying we're at the right end of right history. And this was the whole proposition that communism and socialism was right ended, and that capitalism is on the ascendancy. And I think actually the right ending of the Soviet Union in 1989 actually plunged the international communist movement into crisis of identity, analysis, critique. In parts of India, there was a whole fracturing of the communist movement, and we've ended up in India with 30 communist parties. There was a whole thing about whether it's pro-Soviet Union or pro-China. We have the Maoist movement, Naxal very right movement as well. And actually, I think there's been a dearth of literature. I remember I went to Calcutta about a year ago and went to different places, Eastern Europe, etc. You can't see. I found a book in all the places I visited on the USSR and on the collapse of the USSR and wrote a Marxist right analysis. So your contribution, I think, will be right welcome, because there's hardly any right literature at all as how it's impacted on the critique at outright analysis. And actually at the time we had progress right publishers, we had the books being published on right materialism, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, right, all these books and right literature right to merge right at the time right out of the Soviet Union. And I think theory Marxist right ideas were there. But I think actually with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I remember right 89. I remember going to India about 79, right 80, and we went to right Afghan right airlines, and we stopped in Kabul on the way, and I remember seeing these Russian tanks being attacked and right bombed out. And actually there's a critique is that the Soviet Union was coaxed into that war by the right Americans, because there was an attack on right the communist right movement in Afghanistan, and they got involved. Right, Gorbachev decided at the time to right become involved in that right war, and it actually cost the Soviet Union billions of rubles. We're talking about rubles. It cost them right billions, and I think that right actually was a catalyst at the time of the in terms of glasnost, the cost on the right economy of the Soviet economy, and it had an impact at the time on the ending of the Soviet Union. But I think we've also got to accept as well, I think colleague or Conrad also right to mention, is that the Soviet Union has been right attacked at the time right it emerged, and the development of right the Warsaw Pact and the nuclear right arms race that right happened cost their right economy billions. They would say also right had to invest in the arms race, and they weren't able to use those right resources, those right economic resources on their right housing, on their right economy. It had to go into their right military, which I'd be interested to say your right on that. But I think also, just to end, the Soviet Union right had an impact on right the movements, the anti-colonial right movements in the 60s and 70s in right parts of Africa and Cuba, etc. And the actual impact of right ending of the Soviet Union right is that right America then pivoted from the Soviet Union, right, it went into right the Middle East and started its exploitation in the Middle East. I don't think we heard right. We didn't right American right interventionism, right within the Middle East into the mid-80s. Prior up to that, it was just about right Russia.
Thank you. Marcus?
Thanks, Jack. I've got sympathies with what Ted said. I think the Bolshevik Revolution was a gamble forced upon the Bolsheviks, the 1917, that they had to. I think they had no option but to take power at that time, and their program was for a European revolution, which didn't happen. So I think I think everyone can say that that gamble failed. I mean, some people think it failed immediately. Kautsky certainly did. And it kind of reminds me of when Marx was cautioning against the Parisian working class, don't take power in 1870. But when they did, he championed them, which is the exact opposite of what Kautsky did. He condemned the Bolsheviks for doing what was necessary. And I think that's kind of the difference and why we are Bolsheviks in that sense. So it's the spirit and of that movement that we should be proud to be part of. But clearly it failed. And what I think most comrades, and I've heard that with Raf and also with Ted, is people constantly trying to put external categories that they've got from elsewhere onto the Soviet system, rather than, and I think the benefit of what Hillel and what Jack have done is look at the Soviet system and develop categories out of studying it. And I think Cliff in particular was like, I mean, this is a parody to some extent. Trotsky basically went, well, it's clearly not capitalist, so therefore it must be some form of socialism or workers' republic, and then just sort of build all the weird categories on top of it to justify that. Cliff comes along and says, well, working class isn't in control, obviously, so it can't be any form of workers' state, therefore it must be, capitalism of some sort. And I think that's what we got for most of the 20th century, and nothing much more intelligent than that. I mean, an example of, I think, Raphael's, I mean, it may have been a slip of the tongue. He was talking about capital accumulation and primitive socialist accumulation at the same time. I don't understand that. The competition with other countries, this is taken from Cliff, really, to prove why the Soviet Union was capitalist. I mean, you just look at the amount of trade the Soviet Union had with the West, it was piddling. It was very, very, very small. So I don't think that was it. And I also want to push back though, while we do not uphold the Soviet Union or North Korea as the future, as any form of socialism that we identify with or defend in that sense, there were clearly aspects of those societies after the purges, after the terror, that reflects what the future could look like. In the same way, we condemn capitalism, but there are things within capitalism that are harbingers of the future. Like, the NHS is the standard one we point to as the beginnings of the political economy of the working class. I don't think that was what the Soviet Union was. But I mean, Tina, you tend to get up and just say, Soviet Union was a hellhole, use hellhole a lot. And of course, in that sense, it was. But if that's all we say about the Soviet Union, I mean, there is a nostalgia among some people. I know people who grew up in East Germany, who around my age, who say, it was much better, we were much less stressed, we all had houses, we all had blah, blah. There was the Stasi, and as long as, there was the Stasi, but I think just to say that, I don't think is telling the whole story. Final question, and this is, I'm not, if we're saying that the slaves were not a class and that the workers were not a class, for you, Jack, how does that fit into sort of the understanding that the history of all societies hitherto is class struggle, the history of class struggle, if there weren't classes? So I'm just be curious to hear you come back on that. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Marcus. Nice and concise. Jim and then Mike.
Yeah. Mike McNair said earlier about problems of party building, Stalinism being listed as one, which is, I was wondering, thinking a while back about, did anybody, Lenin, Trotsky, Kamenev is over there, Mao, Kim Il-sung, did any of them ever call their countries communist? The West called them kind of a communist, of course. Trump called Biden a communist, I think only once that I was aware of. All the DSA wins in the States are because of communists, and of course the Democratic Party is communist. So there's no point in any of us calling ourselves socialist, like say the Socialist or the Socialist Workers' Party. If push comes to shove, being in the Labour Party will be a communist. But taking on that sort of insult, and Jack said a few times about the snowball, once we get to that sort of stage, then Trump or Burnham or anybody calling you a communist, if he thinks I'm a communist, bloody hell, I better get in there. It's good. In 1988, I was in Moscow with friends, just missed it. Went into a record shop. Some of you may not remember record shops, but in 1988 they existed. And the biggest record shop in Moscow, and it had a much, much smaller stock than you'd get in any high street in this country at the time. Hardly anything. One of our as Jack said, there were people offering rubles for dollars on the streets. One of our party was offering rubles for pounds. And he said, no, thank you. I said, why not? He said, because they're no fucking use. And a group of them trying to sell rubles all laughed, because they agreed. And what really happened, and what is this all about? And I think Jack's book is essential, and the rest of them will be too. Thank you.
Mike and then, Yasmin's gone. Mike and then Anne then.
Thanks, Jack, for a very useful introduction. I didn't quite manage to get a copy of the hard copy of the book, so I've got the proof in PDF. I just halfway devil's advocate. The question is, in essence, when Marx analyses capital, he's analysing a body of social relations which has grown up in medieval Italy and in the interface between Christendom and the Dar al-Islam, and in the medieval North Sea area, which was an common economic area in the Middle Ages, the Hansa towns, the Netherlands, Eastern England and Eastern Scotland, and has developed already by the time 500. It's been in around 500 years by the time Marx is writing. It's still around the best part of 200 years later. It may well be the case Bill's arguments imply that capitalism won't survive the 21st century. I think capitalism probably won't survive the 21st century, though I think it's more likely that the Americans will bomb the world to smithereens than that we actually reach collapse through climate change. But the Soviet Union, in contrast, created in 1917 the form of the Soviet dictatorial Stalinist regime actually created a double police coup of late 1927 to early 1929, and the first 5-year plan, and collapses in 1989. So it lasts for 2 human lives. Trotsky thought that it was going to collapse in 1939-45. Okay? He was wrong. The reason why he was wrong, in my opinion, is that he was wrong about the war. He thought that the Western Front would be stable and the Eastern Front would be fluid, and in consequence the Soviet Union would collapse. Whereas in reality, because France, Norway and Netherlands fell, and the geopolitical situation of the United Kingdom was destroyed by the fall of the West, and in consequence, Britain and the United States were forced into alliance with the USSR if the United States was going to succeed in restabilising an empire and replacement of the British Empire. And that alliance with the USSR enables so that the USSR, as we see it after the death of Stalin, survives on the memory of the Great Patriotic War and declines gradually on the basis of that. But then you're actually not talking about a social system. You're talking about an event, a short-lived event, an event which lasts sort of 1-2 human lives. In that context, I thought that Ted's first point, Tsarist Russia is massively behind Qing China in terms of the development of the forces of production. The technical development of agriculture, this figure of hammer and sickle, the sickle, you're talking about 10th, 11th century West European agriculture, not 13th, 14th century West European agriculture. Population density is comparable to the European Dark Ages, not to the European Late Middle Ages. The level of infrastructure is comparable to the 10th, 11th, 12th century. Russia, it's this curious thing that exactly the point that the Russian Revolution is posed as a socialist revolution, as a workers' revolution, by the dynamics of world capitalism and not by the internal dynamics of Russia. The gamble on, it's a necessary gamble. It's an inevitable gamble. That's why Kautsky is Kautsky is a scab, precisely because of that. He's already become a scab before he scabs on October. He becomes a scab when he becomes an advocate of Entente victory, which he does in spring 1917. And it's because he's become an advocate of Entente victory that he becomes a scab on October, because he thinks October is weakening the Entente powers and will lead to German victory. But it's in that sense, actually I think we need to think in a sense about elements of continued feudalism in the Stalinist regime, or elements of even pre-feudalism. This thing of meetings with acclamations. The Theodosian Code was adopted in 438 and transmitted from Byzantium to Rome, and the Roman Senate met and adopted it. And the senators shouted, our great emperors, may you reign forever." And the guys who studied the history of this have adopted the methods of Sovietology, which analyse the length of standing ovations in order to establish who's in and who's out, to adopt the length of the acclamations, the number of repeated 27 times, the slogans, repeated 43 times. And you analyse this false unanimity. Raphael, I think, is wrong. I think China, medieval China, is not feudalism, it's Byzantium. Medieval Japan is feudalism. Anyway, that's it. But it's, sorry, I'll wind up. My point is simply, go back to why is the working class, it's not exactly that the work, it's a class in itself, but it's not a class capable of being a class for itself. It's not capable of being a class for itself because actually in the plan system, the workers are dependent on access to housing, food, etc. through the employer. And so that the employer actually is like a manor and the worker is like a serf, yeah? Which is, of course, again, Russia, because of the enormous shortage of labour in Tsarist Russia, you have forced labour continuing much later than in Western Europe, and it resurfaces in Stalinist Russia. So it's extraordinary knot of post-capitalist, pre-capitalist features tied together in this extraordinarily complex structure. I'm not sure that it can be read on its own in that way. That's it.
Comrades, I'm going to give John 15 minutes at the end to come back, and I've got a long list of speakers, so I'm not going to be able to take all of you, I'm afraid. I'm going to take Anne, and then I'm going to take Roxy. I know.
Okay, all right, I think that those were, thank you, Jack, they were excellent points that were made by Mike there on the nature of pre-Soviet Russia and how those forms percolated into the new regime. I think that was perhaps your point. I certainly see that. Just a couple of short points. I think it was maybe a throwaway point. You said it flourished in the early years, and then you described Soviet after the revolution as flourished and then went on to become a different entity after 1928. But of course, yes, it flourished in terms of progressive.
No. I'm talking about after the 5-year plan. It grew
Okay,
at a
all right.
massive
Well, I
rate.
misunderstood. Okay, but anyway, my point is that in the early years, there were progressive ideas that were trying to do so much. There were so many degrees issued as both as in the hope that they could make some progress, but also as a signal to the rest of the communist movement that, you know, this is the kind of thing that they need to be thinking about, that they were giving them a model. Okay, so in terms of the, but of course they were in crisis, economic crisis from the very beginning, and then we had war communism, and then after the destruction of the Civil War, we had the introduction of the new economic policy, what I think Lenin termed state capitalism. So my question, Jack, is to what extent had the new economic policy gone into crisis before the introduction of the first 5-year plan? Because in my study, I see that movement towards top-down actions from Stalin begin from 1926 onwards. You look, my study is on the Soviet East, and you look at the actions there to oppress the religious clergy and other forms of society. And we have the what you call society of the movement of militant atheists anyway, and also many other forms at that time that were like germinating in that period. Maybe that was a period of preparation for the first 5-year plan, but I've often wondered what was the intersection, because we often hear the argument of, you know, it was necessary, that it could do nothing except Stalin was forced to do this. But I wonder what your view on that is. And then just finally, I don't agree with Marcus that there's something of the future after 1928. I mean, you talk about housing. The housing was so bad, you know, several families living in what would have once been an entire apartment. cut off from each other by, you know, little cardboard, they're almost like cardboard walls. I think that if you're looking at socialism as the agency of the working class in that society, there was no agency. And yeah, so Mike has made the point about the peasantry. So just if you allow me, in terms of what became the workers, okay, we look at the mass collectivization of the farms. So they were forced into that. It was like an initiative, a little bit maybe like war communism, but on a much bigger scale. And people were torn, in many respects, from their lives, which they had lived as peasantry under new economic policy, and it happened so quickly. So, and then it was a militarized type of society, and I just can't see in that situation how you could call them, as Raphael said, a proletariat. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Roxy.
Thanks, Jack. And I want to congratulate you on the book. I mean, it's going to be, it's a huge achievement to begin to finish a project of that scale. And I'm very excited to organize a review of it for Partisan. I just wanted to reply to the idea that we can just, like, to the comrade earlier who spoke about state capitalism or the Soviet Union as a form of capitalism. I really just think we're attempting to, like, kind of plug categories in here where they don't belong. Like, I think that how can we talk about capitalism in the Soviet Union when there was no capital in the sense of investment of money capital in physical capital, in productive forces for the accumulation of profit? On the example of highly centralized, statized capitalist economies, I think that we have to sort of reckon with this as these are still economies in which the law of value and the organization of production along capitalist lines was still a prominent feature of the economy. For example, the military zaibatsus in Manchukuo, under the Japanese Empire, they were related to private capitalist firms based in Japan. And Manchukuo was an extension of Japanese capitalism. Now, of course, within Manchukuo, it developed a very peculiar economy, and the reform bureaucrats did, in many ways, model their particular form of statized capitalism on the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union. But I think we should not take it out of context and sort of say, oh, well, then you could just have a sort of fully developed state capitalist economy. Of course, the Soviet Union did trade with the West, but it was only very limited, between, I looked it up before, between 2 and 5% of Soviet GDP was foreign trade, which is radically less than any capitalist economy in the world today. And I don't know about historically, but certainly less than any capitalist economy in the world today. On the question of class, I think that this is something that, we need to kind of wrangle with what our class categories mean. I think that we can read class categories onto the Soviet experience. You have a kind of, it's difficult to say what they were, but bureaucratic, professional, sort of state ruling class, and then a sort of mass of workers. But I think that we also have to recognize that there were other processes going on. The comrades at Chuang magazine, sort of more ultra-left publication, but very strongly influenced by comrades like Hillel. Their essay on Chinese industrialization in the Maoist period, Sorghum and Steel, which is strongly recommend comrades read it, talk about the role of state regulation of labor markets, or labor non-markets, let's say, as reflecting kind of caste categories. In particular, in China, you had the hukou system, which was only recently abolished, in which you had like formal designations of different groups of people. Now, the Soviet Union didn't quite have the same system, not to the degree that the Chinese ever did, but I think that's also a useful category. And these pseudo-class structures were very important in the way that these societies would transition back into capitalism. Now, I think that it's important to note that while I don't think the Soviet Union had a primarily capitalist economy, though it did have, so let's say, secondary capitalist dynamics of internal black markets, which also involved trade with foreign states, but that's obviously complicated. I think it is worth noting is like, what was the purpose of the Soviet state? The comrade earlier said that, you know, well, it was still oriented towards accumulation. Yes, it was accumulation of surplus, but not surplus value. Those are different categories. Feudal society accumulated surplus. The tributary states of like Byzantium and China accumulated surplus. But this is not surplus value. That's a distinct category that is particular to capitalist production. In turn, and I think we should say, yes, there was competition, interstate geopolitical competition. But that is not the same as capitalist competition in a market between capitalist firms. These are not the same categories, and you can't just impose one onto the other. I think the organization of the Soviet economy was primarily to accomplish industrialization of the economy to compete in the geopolitical arena. But that is not the same as international market competition. It is related because states also do this. Capitalist states do it. In military industrialization in Japan, in Japanese Manchukuo, was primarily directed, which was a heavily statized economy, at building up Japanese war industries, not for profit, right? But that is in the context of interstate competition. But this is a capitalist state engaging in interstate competition for the purposes of securing its position in a world market. The Soviet Union was responding to the dynamics of a capitalist world dominated by competing capitalist nation states, in which it was a nation state, but not a capitalist one. Thank you, Conrad.
Yasmin.
Well, the book is dedicated to Hillel, and he was very pleased when he was asked if he would, about the dedication of the book. There's really no time for me to say much in 1 minute, but I think when I read the chapters of the book, I thought it was proof of that issue 1, article 1, volume 1 of Critique, 1973. The title is Towards the Political Economy of USSR. And what developed through the chapters is a description of this entity that is not capitalist in its full meaning, and it's not socialist. It's Hillel calls it, I'm not necessarily 100% with that, but Hillel calls it a transitional system where attempts at socialism have been completely destroyed. And it is that definition that required, if you like, looking at efficiency, labor relations, accumulation, profit, these kind of issues. And every chapter, I think, deals quite well about what are the limitations of the system in being able to, for example, create an efficient production system, or to give the producers, the working class, any limited, however limited, control over their labor, which would be a basic definition of socialism. His arguments against capitalist nature are more or less what Roxy was talking about, in that it is the accumulation, the profit-making, the ownership of the means of production, and the relationship between the producer and the bureaucrat as opposed to the owner. That is part of his arguments. I thought the book did justice on that. I have to emphasize that Hillel never uses anything that could have any positive nuance on USSR. So he doesn't use deformed worker state, and he doesn't like using the term bureaucratic socialism. But if you see that as a negative type of, like feudal socialism, that's okay. That would work.
Thank you, Yasmin. I'm sorry to the comrades who I haven't been able to call in. I'll pass you back to John. He's got a lot of material.
The mic. But you do the mic. Yeah, that was very interesting. Clearly, we need to have more meetings and more discussion. So I found that useful. I'm not going to rewrite the damn thing. But precisely as I said, because a lot of comrades have raised up international questions, and although of course I refer to international questions, I'm deliberately avoiding international questions. So that is for a future book. And you obviously can't talk about the Soviet Union in isolation, but my argument is, of course the Soviet Russia could have collapsed in 1918, 1990, it could have been invaded, the German army. You know, the idea that it was inevitably, it survived, obviously not, the German army in, 1940s could have won. Why not? But the question is, in terms of a Marxist analysis, I would argue of a system, right, of a society, not just a moment. Mike is right. I date the system, in essence, from the first 5-year plan, the system. There was a pre-system that clearly was fed in to that, but the laws I'm trying to discover really date from the first 5-year plan to the end, and that comes to an end in 1991. And I take the Marxist approach, which is to begin with internal contradictions. So, for example, if you take an egg, I could just crush it. Well, it wouldn't tell you much about the dynamics. It wouldn't explain much about the egg. It will tell you a lot about whatever sat on it or how it was dropped. But I'm interested in how the chicken developed or why it didn't develop. That's what I'm interested in. And you can only do that, I think, by locating internal laws, internal contradictions. And that's why I began with the product. Okay, I agree with Mike. Capitalism has been around 500 years. You could even talk about capitalism, in some senses, going back way before that. Merely because something didn't last long doesn't mean it didn't have laws. And my argument is, if you understand how it began, if you understand its internal contradictions, it doesn't explain why things ended in 1991. Can't explain Boris Yeltsin getting on a tank. No, it can't do that, but it can give you roughly that the system must come to an end. This system could not survive. Maybe in isolation, perhaps, but it was not only stagnant, it was dysfunctional, right? And it was dysfunctional not because of the malign, or the incompetence of leaders, but because of the functioning, the working out of internal laws, which can be discovered and laid bare. That's the argument. Okay, so Raphael, you said that the Soviet Union produced use values, of course, but I think you got confused. You said it produced commodities, I think, in order to accumulate, something like that. Well, the Soviet Union produced products, it produced use values in order to accumulate. A steel plant in the Soviet Union was a use value. It produced steel. That does not make it a commodity. The steel was delivered. There was no return from who you delivered it to. So you could deliver the steel, make it up, to a coal mine. The coal mine might have put some rubles on a bank account. That is irrelevant, right? The rubles were confiscated, right? So just ignore rubles for the moment. So, okay, I deliver my still. Okay, I maybe got myself in a trap there, Bob. But I've got to say, nothing came back. Well, coal came back. So I'll choose a different... Anyway, you get the point. The point I'm making is there was no necessary reciprocal relationship between one plant or another. There was in terms of you need coal to produce steel, you need steel for girders. But that's it, right? That is all that you get in the Soviet Union. And that wasn't decided by the individual enterprise. That is decided elsewhere, right? So things function from above. Now, there might be bartering going on below, but I'm in essence ignoring that, because if you head into details, you get confused, and you actually then produce something that is incoherent. My argument is that while I don't discount external questions, external competition, I do think that you can produce a coherent account if you take bureaucrats, workers, and peasants. I think you can produce a coherent account of why the system did what it did. And you mentioned NEP. Right? Well, of course, there are those that say you could have kept NEP going. I don't think it was just Stalin. I think NEP was malfunctioning, right? Stalin pushed it, that's true. Bukharin resisted it, but it was not functioning, right? The peasantry were in an incredibly strong position. And that's why you had forced grain deliveries. So market, when you send Red Army men to the village to take the grain, they might have given them a credit note. I'm sure the peasants were very grateful for that. So it wasn't working. And what you got is actually the peasants were getting richer and the towns were in danger of going hungry, let alone the needs, as we've just said, for building steel plants, to build tanks and all the rest of it. So I think even by looking at the system in isolation, which I know it wasn't isolated, but approaching it that way, I think we'll start to discover something that's worthwhile about the system. As I said, it's initial dynamism with the first 5-year plan. You import your German technology, German engineers, American technology. You get it going, as I said, through miracles, getting ragged workers, right? And then you start producing steel on an incredibly high level in terms of where you were before. That's clearly a success. My argument is, and that's why I illustrated it with the computer, is that they couldn't continually revolutionize this technology. So it would be, you ended up, in terms of the old plant, being antique. You could update your technology if you opened a new plant. So, for example, Togliatti Grad. Has everyone heard of Togliatti Grad? If you haven't, you certainly know, if you go around London, I'm sure it's true of any capitalist country, the Lada car. Right? That is, I think, 1960s Italian technology, not just a car, but Italian technology. The problem was that technology upgraded. At the same time, is it 124? Fiat 124, which is a lot, that was then redundant in Italy, right? Was the Lada car continually replaced? No, the Lada car, I think, still around now-ish. I'm not against old things, by the way, but I'm just trying to illustrate the problem. And the problem is, while you've got spare workers or potential workers in the home, in the countryside, right, or wherever, then you can open a new plant. If you run out of workers, what are you going to do? And the Soviet Union was running out of people. All you need to do is read the general secretaries, right? Women aren't having enough children, and they say, that means we haven't got enough workers. Our model of expansion is new factory, new factory, new factory. They knew if you couldn't fill that factory, they've got a problem. How would you persuade women to have children? Give them prizes. I mean, what they couldn't do is say, women, you have more time off. I mean, big time off. Because every factory is short of workers. So you've got this contradiction. So what I call the bureaucracy of the centre, what I call Gosplan, can see that going on. On the other hand, does a factory manager go, yeah, you take 6 months off, you take a year off, you work less, that's fine by me. I'll introduce new technology. They didn't introduce new labour-saving technology. They went around and did their damnedest to recruit new workers to their factory. So although we've got this notion of totalitarianism, the centre is in complete, it wasn't in control. Precisely what you had is competition between different enterprises, not in terms of the market. I don't think there was a labour market, right? But for labour, yes, you did have that competition. So a factory manager, if they could treat their workers well, and they tried, would tend to keep workers, would tend to attract workers. They were still short, but as I said, if you were a bastard, then you were more or less guaranteed to lose workers. And under Stalin, that could mean a gulag sentence or death. So yeah, I don't buy the company town thing. But the question would be that if you took a company town and you took it, well, I don't know, well, I've got time to go there. If you take a company town and you have it in isolation, that's one thing. The question is, with a company town, as far as I understand, couldn't the workers just walk out? I mean,
They did.
you know, in the Soviet Union, you could walk out of the factory, you couldn't walk out of the Soviet Union. And, anyway, so I'll leave that one behind. I don't buy the view, by the way, that you had a problem of labour discipline and therefore terror. I think you had a problem of labour discipline from the beginning, and you had a problem of labour discipline at the end without terror. Okay, anyway.
3 o'clock.
Yeah, I know. Oh, Jesus. All right, okay. Ted, I don't think that it was a mode of production. I'll finish with this. I don't think it was a mode of production. I describe it as a freak society. And my argument is, if you look at periods of transition from one mode of production to another mode of production, you get freaky occurrences. And I would rather view the Soviet Union as a freaky form of society, which, yes, can be studied, rather than some socialism, but if only this or that had happened. So I'm much more inclined to say that this society was produced, yes, by a workers' revolution. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of that, but it had no future in and of itself. It was a dead end, and that doesn't represent the future. Finish with that, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you, John. See everybody. Jack at, of course, at 3:30.
Sorry.
Down, Tina. Yeah, yes, I am. You're still co-host, Anya. Can you see me? Yes. All right, okay. Can you put me on screen? Aha. I'll try speaking in a second. Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Sorry.
Maybe not.
Said you're still broadcasting.
Oops, shit, we're still live.
You need some help.
Yeah. But